we can't really talk about the future of giving without talking about the shift in what it means to give. Research shows that more and more people are associating giving with time and ability and voice. So as we see a shifting landscape of giving and philanthropy and legacy, it means something different today than it did just a few years ago.
Welcome to More Than Profit, the podcast where values, vision, and capital converge. Produced by Axis Ventures, this show spotlights the leaders and innovators redefining success, not just through financial returns, but by the impact they create. Every episode dives into the inspiring stories, bold ideas, and hard-won lessons of those who are leveraging capital, financial, intellectual, and social, for equity, sustainability, and systematic change. Whether you're an investor, entrepreneur, or purpose-driven professional, we are here to challenge the status quo, push the boundaries of traditional investing, and inspire you to align your resources with your values. Join us as we explore how capital can be a force for meaningful change.
Today's conversation lives at the intersection of generosity and ownership. We talk a lot about writing checks, about year-end giving, and about donor-advised funds that sound helpful, but often feel opaque. But what if the asset that could most reshape your community isn't sitting in your checking account at all? It's sitting on your cap table. My guest argues that donating equity, actual ownership in a company, should be as natural as writing a check. Movements like Pledge 1% have already nudged founders in that direction, channeling billions in pledged equity towards causes they care about. And there's a much bigger horizon here. Over the next couple of decades, we're going to see an unprecedented transfer of privately held business wealth. The question is whether that value quietly migrates away from the places that created it, or whether some of it gets recycled back into the entrepreneurial ecosystems that need it most. But this isn't simple. Donor-advised funds can be clarifying or confusing depending on who's guiding you. Appraisals, reps and warrants, UBIT, holding periods. These are friction points that scare off donors and overwhelm nonprofits. So what's actually true about DAFs? When is donating equity better for you and for the organizations you love than giving cash after an exit? Can Main Street owners, not just unicorn founders, actually use this tool? And could a culture of equity giving seed community funds that act like the most risk-tolerant capital that we have? On today's episode, we get concrete. We talk timelines, tax mechanics, and why simplicity, not just tax strategy, is the real value of DAFs in complex gifts. And we think bigger, how a little structural creativity could turn generosity into a flywheel for local innovation. So Landon, you were just on another amazing podcast with Brad Feld, and you guys were talking about building ecosystems. You guys have been friends for a while, and he's really passionate about both entrepreneurs, ecosystem development, but also how do we give back? How do we think about this idea of generosity? What does that look like in the context of community? So from your perspective, maybe even kind of thinking back on that conversation, when it comes to generosity, what are some of the ecosystem shifts that you think are going to be necessary to make donating equity as natural as writing a check?
Yeah, well, first off, we can't really talk about the future of giving without talking about the shift in what it means to give. Research shows that more and more people are associating giving with time and ability and voice. So as we see a shifting landscape of giving and philanthropy and legacy, it means something different today than it did just a few years ago. Yeah, Brad and I had a great conversation on his podcast, Give First, episode 97, I think, if you want to go find it. We met for the first time at Big Omaha, a conference that went on for several years, great conference out in Omaha, Nebraska. And David Hauser, who sold Grasshopper to Cisco, he was the MC for the conference. And he and I and Brad and a couple of other people were talking. And Brad introduced me to the concept of Pledge 1%. And this stems from Mark Benioff and Brad Fell and others who decided, we should be giving. When they thought about giving, they thought about that thing which they were closest to, which was business and the startups that they funded. And so giving for them meant time, it meant profits, and it also meant equity, actual ownership in the business that they would give to the things that they cared about. And they started a movement that inspired startups around the world to give. And per my recent conversation with their team, I think they're north of $3 billion in equity that has been given or pledged through Pledge 1%. So quite a movement, but that is just scratching the surface because we have potentially trillions of dollars changing hands in the decades to come and a massive opportunity to give time and profits and equity in businesses.
Man, that's crazy. $3 billion. So Landon, help me. So you obviously, I got excited about talking to you today about this concept of donating equity. And obviously you're passionate about it. And it's something that you kind of came upon because you had started and sold a company and we're like, hey, is there an opportunity to do this? How do we support nonprofits that we care about, but in a way that is tax advantaged, better for the nonprofit? There's got to be somebody that's figured this out. So can you maybe walk us back and give us like a little history lesson on what's led you to this moment of starting Donate Equity as a company? Because you've done it as a consultancy for a long time, but what does that look like today? And how did you even get to this point?
Yeah. So what stood out to me about Brad's message that day at Big Omaha was that they had standardized the process a little bit. And so if we rewind, I had a small exit in 2014, and I donated ownership in a startup to a charity. And I had never done it. The financial professionals around me had never done it, had never heard of it. But I knew from a background in nonprofit that had seen people donate cars and boats and other strange resources, right, to charity. And so I thought, well, if someone could donate one of these assets, surely a piece of a company might be of interest to a charity. And so we figured out how it worked. And I had people who helped guide me along the way. Bill High, who was at the National Christian Foundation, Heartland at the time, now Signatory, he invited me along to some coffees, and during which he spoke about donating equity, and he illustrated the benefits to the charity, the tax benefits to the donor, and was willing to just take some time to show me the ropes. And then when I went through the process myself, it's like a full diligence if you've been through an M&A process selling a company or raising a round of funding from a venture capitalist. There's a data room, there are financial share and governing documents, and there's a full diligence that happens both on the receiving charity to make sure that they understand what they're receiving. And every one of these donations of equity, I didn't know this at the time, now I do, every one requires an appraisal, a third-party arm's length appraisal of the value of the company. The donor has to find an appraiser. So I had to go out and source an appraiser. And so it's quite a burden on the donor. And so I wanted to start helping people give in this way. And what really kicked it off, again, was that conversation with Brad. I realized all of a sudden there were other people who did this. There was a process, there was a movement. And David Hauser leaned over and said, well, I've sold this company. I have these other companies. Is this something I might benefit from? And he's spoken about this on podcasts as well. And so I ended up starting an LLC and helped him give, and then started helping others.
It's really cool. So one of the things that you and I have talked about for a while, and obviously full disclosure, we work together and as it pertains to Donate Equity and the AV Foundation, because I do see this as an unbelievable tool to unlock generosity and to create even more impact for the world and for people as they think about strategy around giving. But historically, people have looked at donor advised funds as kind of as opaque or transactional or just a tax advantage kind of solution. How do you see this idea of donating equity, even just reframing donor advised funds as really a tool for strategic generosity? And so it's not just this financial tax advantage, but it really truly is an opportunity to catalyze more of who they are in what they want to manifest in the world.
Yeah, when I think about donor advised funds, I think about simplicity first. I think about the ability to give into one charitable account and having one receipt at the end of the year instead of managing receipts for all of the different organizations that one might give to. And from a donor's perspective, when giving closely held business interest, you're usually in the midst of people proposing to buy your company, and you might have some interested suitors. You're trying to determine, do I let my baby go, right? This company that I've been building for what might be decades or even generations, multi-generational companies. And so you're wrestling with all of that. A donor advised fund and the organization sponsoring that fund support the entrepreneur and make things so much more simple for them and really take so much burden off of them during what can be a stressful time of selling a business or thinking about selling a business. And so really when I think of donor advised fund, I think of simplicity. Now, of course, there are the tax benefits, and it's one of several vehicles that someone might use when donating closely held business interests. You know, entrepreneurs occasionally will want to give directly to a charity that's made an impact on their lives or that they believe in. And while that's noble of them to really point out that executive director that they know at the charity, usually it feels like a burden to that person. It's both joy and burden because they've never accepted one of these. And they possibly, if they're like the tens of thousands of nonprofits that are just over $1 million in operating budget, they're not sure if they can handle it. And if they're like the 1.5 million that have much less than $1 million in their operating budget, they don't have the staff to account for a gift on their books, to conduct the diligence of this asset. So it almost feels like a burden. So when that happens, a donor advised fund through a foundation is a relief to most nonprofit leaders. They're able to redirect the donor to a foundation who can support them better account for that gift. And for a small fee, there is quite a lot of burden and headache and process taken off of their shoulders. So in the end, they might receive a liquid gift of cash that they can put toward their good purposes without having to do something they've really never been trained to do before.
Yeah. Well, give us, just brass tacks benefit. So it's cool to say, oh, I could donate complex stock or whatever, complex asset. What is the brass tacks bottom line benefit to the donor if they actually do what we're talking about, whether they work with you or not? Because there's foundations that are set up to kind of handle some of these complex transactions. But if they do this, what are we talking about as a brass tacks benefit to this possible Founder X? So Founder X, they're about to approach liquidity. Walk us through kind of, for our listeners, what this actually means.
Yeah. So the average donation, maybe I'll just start here. What does one of these donations look like? The national average is about $250,000 in value of closely held business interest that's given. When we look at foundations who have been doing this a long time, who've been set up to do this, the average is $3 to $5 million in an equity gift. And so I'll start there. That's what an average gift looks like. And then I should also state that when a donor gives to the nonprofit and that asset is transferred, the ownership of that is transferred to the charity, the donor can start receiving tax benefits immediately. So the day that transaction happens, they can start reporting that to the IRS. And so there will be a report. I mentioned the appraisal. There are forms that the IRS requires for these sort of gifts. And so at tax time, that donor in the year that they gave can immediately start receiving write-offs on their taxes, reduction in capital gains, possibly income tax, other taxes. And so immediate benefit to the donor in the year of the gift. So how much, right? What does that benefit look like? It varies on the type of organization that the gift goes to. So if someone gives directly to a 501c3, think their local church, their alma mater, if they directly give, they can write off up to 50% of their income and can roll that over for up to 5 years. That can be a huge benefit. It also allows a donor, especially someone who might have variable income, to plan the years in which they will receive certain income, write off some of that income. And so there's some great planning that's made available because of that. In addition to income, capital gains tax benefits are huge with these gifts. So if I'm giving a percentage of my company to charity, that is appreciated, that appreciated asset, that gain, I'm no longer being taxed on for that portion that I've given. So if you're at the 20% capital gains rate, that can be significant, right? So once we start stacking these benefits, you're looking at 20, 30% at least, right, in your tax benefit in the year of the gift, even if you don't sell that business until some later year. So the benefits are huge, they're quite significant, and they're immediate in the year of the gift.
Each year, about 3.5 million young people in America graduate high school and step into adulthood, surrounded by family, guidance, and support. But for 20,000 of them, those aging out of foster care, that transition is far more uncertain. No parents to call, no safety net to fall back on, just a world that expects them to figure it out alone. At Access Ventures, we believe that behind every statistic is a story. Fracture to Flourish is our new podcast series that amplifies those stories. In our first series, Aging Out, we sit with those who've lived it and those working to change the system. What does it really take to support a young adult in that transition? And how do we shift from survival to stability, from fracture to flourishing? Listen to the entire first season now, wherever you get your podcasts.
So then walk us through some of the friction points. So it's like, okay, this sounds awesome. I think there's a lot of founders out there or business owners, which there are a lot that give substantially. What are the friction points? Obviously, you've already mentioned a couple of them, which is finding the folks that can help you with certain parts of it, like this third-party appraisal or people that understand the tax implications or the legal implications. What are some of the friction points maybe for the donor? And then what are some friction points even for the nonprofit that's receiving this type of complex asset? Like, if we're going in eyes wide open, how should somebody be thinking about this type of opportunity?
Yeah. So many ways to answer that. And so let me, and that's why we exist. That's why we created Donate Equity, is that there are a lot of friction points.
Oh my gosh, there's a company that does this with you?
Yeah. So yeah, let's start with the donor. The donor is usually completely unaware that this exists. And so they find out through their financial advisor, they find out through a friend who's maybe done this before. And so they start
or after the fact, unfortunately.
Yeah, and many times after the fact. Yeah. I've sold my company. I always pictured selling it and giving cash to something I cared about. And now I realize that I left so much money on the table. Either I paid it to Uncle Sam, I didn't give it to the charity I cared about. So it can be a frustrating experience after the exit. We meet a lot of people who have that sentiment. So let's assume someone does find out ahead of an exit. This is pre-IPO, pre-M&A. They find out that this exists. There's an education period, right? All these questions, like the ones that you're asking, right? So we walk through all of those questions about what is the benefit and what are the drawbacks? Who can I give to? When can I give? When should I not give? And so as a donor is walking through those questions, they have usually a team around them, informally or formally, that's helping them make these decisions. Could be an attorney, it could be their their CPA, a financial planner, wealth manager. There are all sorts of people who might be speaking in their ear, not to mention family, co-founders or co-owners in the business, acquirers, potential acquirers, right? So quite a few voices speaking into the entrepreneur. And so what we try to do is to kind of pierce through that noise and offer simple frameworks for decision-making for an entrepreneur. I've been there. I understand the pain personally. I've walked a lot of people through this over the years. So we just try to make that as simple as possible for the donor so that they can make an informed decision well in advance of any sort of sale. Something I mentioned, co-founders and co-owners, something we see is another friction point is that someone might have taken investment from others, from a venture firm, for example, and an investor might have certain rights, might be able to, and may have voting rights, for example, on whether or not the company sells, whether or not the company can even gift shares, right? So usually the board is also involved in one of these decisions, the advisors and board of a company. So a lot of stakeholders to be considered. I think that's maybe my broad point number one is it takes a lot of people to get one of these transactions across the table. If we maybe skip over to the nonprofit now, a nonprofit, as I mentioned, if they are one of the over 1.5 million nonprofits that simply don't have the resources to accept and diligence and account for a gift, they're left with this feeling of both opportunity and yet they're constrained because they can't accept. Let me take one example of someone who's constrained. Endowments. So at a university, they might want to accept a gift of closely held business interest, but they're governed by case standards, which prevent them from accounting for that gift in certain ways. They will have to wait until it becomes liquid in order to count it toward their goals. So there are a lot of reasons why a nonprofit might not want to accept that form of gift, either inability or regulatory reasons why they wouldn't be able to. There are reps and warrants that a nonprofit makes when they accept a gift. They're assuming that based on their diligence, this company doesn't have outstanding debt or there's no liabilities. A business isn't sitting on a brownfield site or something like. So there are a lot of risks in accepting these complex gifts. And that's why that diligence is so important and why many small nonprofits have traditionally had a difficult time. And I think when you look at the complexity involved and you look at these reps and warrants, the risks involved, the need for diligence, you start to see why most of these gifts happen through a foundation, through a larger nonprofit, many times go through a donor advised fund or other vehicle instead of directly to the charity. One other thing I would mention is holding times. This is one of the biggest challenges in this space, and one that we're addressing soon, we're working on, is the liquidity of the gift. So if I give to a nonprofit I care about, and I think that I'm going to sell the business next year, but in reality it falls through, and I end up not being able to sell the business for 6 years, I pass an IRS mandated threshold. So after 5 years, nonprofits can start incurring taxes, unrelated business income that as a result of holding on to the assets. So there are tax implications for the nonprofit if they don't follow and adhere to the guidelines set forth by the IRS. So in response to that, some large charitable organizations will include clauses for buyback provisions. So if I don't sell my company, I have to buy it back from the nonprofit, which is kind of standard practice. But that gets complicated in, let's say, a high affinity group like a university. So all of a sudden, my really important alum who wanted to give, I'm forcing them to do something they didn't expect to do, use their hard-earned money to buy back some equity. So it can create conflict, and So that's something else to be aware of. And there are precedent examples, templates, and things that can be really helpful in those situations.
Yeah. So talk to me about the UBIT too, because I think sometimes people get terrified of taxes, like unrelated business income tax. When might there be a circumstance where a nonprofit is fine accepting a gift where the transaction doesn't occur for 6, 7, 8 years, where that's okay? Because a UBIT's not necessarily a penalty insofar as like, okay, if there's income generated or cash flow from this business, what's a circumstance where that just might be something that's factored into the diligence and it's like, okay, great. It may be further out beyond that 5-year threshold, but that's okay. We're fine paying this UBIT because one, like you said, there's a relationship here that matters, or there's actually greater benefit for us if we continue to hold this beyond the 5 years. What does that look like in your experience?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. Obviously, there is a cost benefit analysis that happens. And one of our past clients is a large foundation. They have a special letter ruling from the IRS to hold on to assets and certain types of assets for long periods of time. They're comfortable paying the taxes that they incur because the significance of the gift is pretty incredible. So some gifts on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars in single gifts. Whole companies, right? That's another example. Someone gifting, not pledging 1% of a business, but saying, I'm committing this business to what I believe in, right? So I'm actually committing this entire business to a charity. So in that situation, any reasonable person would say the benefits of owning this very valuable cash producing business would outweigh any relatively small taxes that the organization will incur. So yeah, I think you're right. A lot of people see that as, oh no, we avoid at all cost. But, I think for the smartest foundations and nonprofits, that's not the case. It's a judicious payment of taxes for a larger benefit over time.
Now, you talked a little bit about like some of these, okay, somebody donating an entire company or the hundreds of millions of dollar deal. But I'm even just thinking about some of my friends that own, just Main Street businesses that are cash flowing, that do really, really, really well. And they're not necessarily thinking about a liquidity event. Maybe, but maybe not, but they cash flow a ton. When might there be a benefit for them to consider donating some equity to, say, a donor advised fund or to their favorite charity, even when that horizon may not be as far out because they have cash flow and the tax burden is outweighed by this cash benefit? Because I'm thinking like not most people that are listening are not going to be that $100 million company. They're not going to be that $1 billion unicorn startup. They're going to own an HVAC company that's got some great cash flow and has multiple locations across a region or something.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Let's contrast those two. So one is the high growth startup at any size. The point is it's growing very fast. And because it's growing fast, its value, the appraised value, is increasing over time, right? Dramatically. So we'll compare that to the HVAC company. While the HVAC company could be growing really fast as well, let's assume this is a steady straight line growth, no dramatic curve up, but it's throwing off cash. So if we compare these two, the startup founder, it likely makes sense for them to either wait until the latest time that might be possible, right? Whereas they're probably going to want to optimize the value when they give the value for the charitable purpose, right, that they're giving to, and any tax benefits. The smaller Main Street business, or even a large, slowly growing Main Street business, could give years in advance, and the appraised value won't be that different. And therefore, their tax benefit will not be significantly different if they give today versus 3 years from now versus 5 years from now. So they could give today without waiting, start receiving the tax benefits and be able to use them appropriately year by year, depending on their overall tax situation. So yeah, I certainly advise fast growing companies, whatever kind of company they are, to weigh the cost benefit of giving today, later, or a combination of the two, a small bit now and a small bit later. And so certainly as a nonprofit, as you're weighing those options, you have to think, okay, if this company does give early, am I okay paying taxes on this if and when I need to? And if not, I need to include a buyback provision. If so, right, I'll deal with it appropriately. And so, yeah, that's one way that I think about those two situations.
So obviously we're talking about donating equity, but you have personally been in kind of the entrepreneurial ecosystem space for a long time, and you actually have a PhD in entrepreneurship. So you've been really, I think, personally passionate about this idea of like removing systemic barriers that entrepreneurs face in accessing capital. Maybe, I've talked about this, but I just wanted to kind of bring it before the listeners a little bit. Could you explain like how you think donating equity, even back to a community fund, if you will, could be one of those tools that helps close that gap for entrepreneurs?
Absolutely. Yeah. So my work, I guess I should say, I come from a rural community. And so resource constraint was just the norm growing up. So when I started my first business in high school to pay for college, I wasn't buying brand new equipment. This was a construction business. I was fixing dilapidated old pieces of equipment and getting them running. The concept of taking on investment, much less even a loan, was a stretch for me. So I'm used to a resource constrained environment. I think about that a lot in my work day to day at Elevate Ventures. We're funded by the state of Indiana to invest in entrepreneurs wherever they are, right? In the middle of nowhere, in a rural environment, in an urban environment, across the entire state of Indiana. So we also think about resource constraint and giving opportunity to every growth-minded entrepreneur wherever they are. So where does that capital come from? Well, one might be from the state, as in Elevate's example. Another might be philanthropic dollars, right? So we have some really neat examples that you're aware of, I'm aware of people who have chosen to not only give their cash and their equity to something charitable, putting in a donor advised fund, for example, but then not only letting it sit there and earn a little bit of interest over time in the public markets or something, but instead they've found ways to take those charitable dollars and reroute them to not just causes they care about, but entrepreneurial communities they care about. And so I think there's a tremendous opportunity as companies are being acquired, as PE roll-up strategies kind of encompass the country, an opportunity for us to keep some of those dollars, if nothing else, through a charitable vehicle in local communities, in local ecosystems, so we can recycle those dollars back into entrepreneurs, business owners who need it most.
Yeah. I mean, you and I have talked about this, but imagine if these entrepreneurs that care about place and community and supporting entrepreneurs and their ecosystem pledged a percentage of the businesses that the community helped build. I mean, nobody does this alone. It's not in isolation. Your investors, your stakeholders, your neighbors, your customers. So to say, you know what, that matters, and I want to support this. Imagine if all of them took a percentage and then it went into some sort of a community fund that then supported into perpetuity that type of a thriving ecosystem. To your point, where there could be philanthropic dollars that are kicked off to support the entrepreneurial support organizations providing the technical assistance. There could be high-risk loan funds that are program-related type investments that are charitable in purpose, but also do return. And then there could be venture, like they can invest. And so where there's diligence and opportunity to create like a thriving pool of capital for any type of ecosystem, man, that would be amazing. It would be awesome.
Well, philanthropic dollars, I think, and our time and our energy and like part of our company, like that is maybe some of the greatest risk capital that there is, right? We are
100%.
willing to take risks with our time on someone who may or may not ever be able to pay us back, right?
100%.
I'm taking the risk of my money on someone who likely will never pay me back. And this is something Brad and I talked about, and he talks about in his book, Give First, is this idea of investing time and investing money and mentoring others and doing it in a way in which you may not know in what way it ever comes back to you, if it does, right? But you're doing it because you should do it. You should lead with that sort of activity. So that's, when I think of philanthropic dollars or time, I see it as the most risk tolerant capital that we can deploy.
100%. Man, I wish more people had that perspective. So, well, Landon, we were talking right before I hit record, so I wanted to pull this back in, and so we can kind of go out with it. But we were talking about the changing landscape of venture and just the climate right now. But then really the opportunity I think that presents for things like donor advised funds or donating equity or some of these really interesting conversations around catalytic capital and generosity. Could you kind of give us a picture of like what the opportunity might be given the constrained capital climate that we're in right now?
Yeah. Well, right now, maybe I'll address that in a couple of ways. One, from a venture capital perspective, it is very clear. The data is very clear. Investment is moving to AI, right? This comes as no surprise. When we look at where is AI, where are AI native companies, where are the fastest growing companies that are absorbing most of the venture dollars, they are limited to just a few spots on the global map, right? And so when we think about the free market economy, which I am a fan of, those dollars are moving away from places where you and I live, right? And they're going elsewhere. And so in that void, there's no better time, and there's no more critical time, I think, for people to step up with their philanthropic dollars with an investment lens in their communities, their ecosystems, and in entrepreneurs. So I think there's a huge void being created, and the same opportunities that were there yesterday are there today. It's just that I think there are these new, wildly aggressive opportunities elsewhere now. And so we still have these great companies, these great founders who are saying like, where's the capital that was available? Well, it's being gobbled up on the coast right now. And so I think there's a chance to step in and bring new dollars to bear. The other thing is that private equity is buying up companies like never before. There's a transfer of wealth to the next generation, to private equity. And so just the amount of money changing hands over the next 10 or 15 years is unlike anything we've ever seen. And some of those dollars will churn back into communities, but most of them, just like the companies themselves that are rolled up by PE, will be migrating away from rural communities. And so places that are dear to me. So I think there's even another special opportunity for philanthropic. I'm going to throw this out into the world and see what happens here.
Love it.
Philanthropic, like PE platforms, right? Like we've seen some of these pop up, people who are holding in perpetuity for the sake of the employees and the communities. So I think there's a neat way for philanthropy to overlap in that world. And I hope that we see that more and more over the next year or two. Overall, Bryce, like just massive opportunities created by what might be a massive void here in the middle.
You know, I appreciate you saying that because I do think, one, there's so much fear, anxiety right now because of the steep learning curve that AI has presented just on the individual person's level, but also the company level. And so people then what happens is they pull back or they're like, oh gosh, am I too late or whatever. But it's neat to kind of reframe that and say, actually, we have a really interesting opportunity here. You know, there's an opportunity for these places that are not the San Franciscos of the world. And there's an opportunity still for innovation, especially where there's risk capital available, like philanthropy and this transfer of wealth. There is an amazing opportunity, I think, if people are willing to kind of look for it. Here's what lingers for me after this conversation. When we change what counts as giving, we change what becomes possible. Equity gifts aren't a loophole. They're a language, one that translates entrepreneurial success into long-term place-based impact. Donor-advised funds, they're not the villain or the hero. They're a tool. In the right hands with the right partners, they reduce friction, protect nonprofits from risk, and let founders act before the exit, not after the regret. If you're a founder or a Main Street owner, the invitation is practical. Ask earlier. Bring your CPA, attorney, and a charitable partner into the room before a term sheet shows up. Start small if you need to. And if you run a nonprofit, don't go it alone. Find a foundation or a platform that can shoulder the diligence so opportunity doesn't feel like a burden. And for communities watching capital consolidate elsewhere, imagine a norm where a slice of local exits cycles back into a shared fund for entrepreneurs, technical assistance, and patient, risk-tolerant bets. That's not charity as an afterthought. That's strategy as generosity. Thanks for listening. And if this sparked ideas or changed your sense of what giving can be, share the episode with someone building something where you live. Let's make donating equity as natural as writing a check. Today's episode of More Than Profit was hosted by me, Bryce Butler. Our executive producer is Crystal Esquivel, and our associate producers are Bryn McKay and Bailey Pendleton. Graphics design is by Justin Esquivel, and audio production assistance is provided by Resonate Recording.
Thanks for tuning in to More Than Profit, a podcast produced by Access Ventures. We hope today's conversation inspired you to think differently about how values, vision, and capital can create meaningful change. To stay up to date, make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. While you're there, we'd love if you left a review to help others find the show. Visit us at www.accessventures.org/podcast for additional content and past episodes. You can also join the conversation by following us on Twitter at ACS Ventures. I'm Bryn McKay, and you've been listening to More Than Profit, a production of Access Ventures. See you next time.